All right, in this section, you're going to learn about lighting and color and what a lot of these functions do. Why would you want to adjust levels or curves in a photo? How do these tools work? So there are many different uses for this, but whenever you want to adjust lighting, when you want to make darker areas darker or darker areas lighter, or lighter areas darker or lighter areas lighter, you want to use the curves and the levels adjustments, for example. Maybe you want to switch hue, the color of something, or the saturation, how saturated a color is. These are different tools that we can use in Photoshop that can be pretty useful whether we're editing a digital design or we're editing a magazine advertisement, a portrait, or a landscape photo. All right, so let's get started. In the next two lectures, you'll learn about the levels and curves adjustments in Photoshop a little bit more in depth, and these can be powerful tools for adjusting tonality in images. So go ahead and open up Zoom and Navigation Beach and Kelly.jpg, or you can open up a photo you've taken just to practice on. And if you go to Image, Adjustments, and then Levels, you'll see this little hill here. A lot of people are confused about what this does, and in the next one I'll show you, we'll do this as an adjustment layer, but this one's a little bit larger, so I'll keep this one on the screen. So you'll notice this image is very heavily weighted to the left. That means there's more pixels that have just darker tones. All right, so it might be saying it's a little bit underexposed, but a lot of nighttime photos will look like that. Sometimes when photos are underexposed, they'll look like that. So if I move this out of the way and make sure preview is checked, and click and drag this midtone slider, it's this little gray arrow over to the left, I think that improves this photo a little bit. You can see the before and after, it's not as dark. It's balanced a little bit better as far as the lighting goes. Now if you bring this one over, it's going to make it a little bit darker, obviously, and you'll bring this one over. If there's ever there's just no pixels on an image, like say there were just right here, there were no pixels right there, what you can do is just click and drag so it begins wherever that kind of mountain range begins. Right now it begins on the edge, so we want to keep those on the left and the right. But a lot of people are confused about what these actually do, and it's easier to make adjustments once you truly understand it. So this top one right here, the black arrow, if I click and drag it over, you'll see that makes the dark areas, the shadows, darker. And the one on the right, this makes the highlights, or the lighter areas, lighter. And it doesn't affect the darker ones as much, as you can see. And those are the input levels. If you look at the output levels, it does the opposite. The shadows of the dark areas become lighter, so you open up those shadows. And then on this side, the lighter areas become darker. So just to review, darker becomes darker, lighter becomes lighter, lighter becomes darker, and darker becomes lighter. So that's what those sliders do. We're adjusting by default RGB, the red, green, blue channels. You can click there and adjust each channel individually if you wanted. And you can also set the darkest point with the black eyedropper tool there. So if you found an area that was just completely black, you could click that. You can really mess up an image. I mean, if you click an area that's not completely black, but so I'll click maybe somewhere in there. And then if you set the white area, and I'd probably want to zoom in, but and there's the before and then after, so it's slightly different. And you can also set the gray point by using that middle eyedropper. You could try auto and see what it is telling you to do and see that before and after it's very subtle, but it's better to make a manual adjustment. And you can use auto as a starting point if you want and see what Photoshop thinks that we should do to make it a better looking photo, but we're going to be able to make the photo look better than an auto setting in Photoshop. If you do some kind of settings and you like it and you think it'll work on other photos, you can save it as a preset up here. There are also a couple presets up here like darker, increased contrast, and so on, so you can check those out. Now remember, we don't want to go up to image adjustments levels. What we want to do, unless you're just editing one layer and you don't care about adjusting the effect later, but if you do, click down here, the bottom of the layers panel, and there's create a new adjustment layer. Remember, we want to do that. If you go to levels, same exact menu, it's just a little bit different color depending on your presets you have in Photoshop. I'll move the layers over here a little bit. And so this does the same thing. Dark becomes darker, light becomes lighter, dark becomes lighter, lighter becomes darker, and so on. So if you did do some kind of adjustment here, and then this is the great thing about an adjustment layer, I can double click it and it's a live effect. We can adjust it, and it also comes with a mask. So if you wanted to paint out some of the areas that you didn't want affected, let's say you didn't want the grass affected, you could paint some black onto that mask and it would mask out so it's not affected on certain areas of the image. So that's how levels works. If you want to open up a landscape example, if I go to, let's use the adjustment layer here and go to levels, you'll see this one is the opposite. Instead of being underexposed, or according to Photoshop, there's even some hot spots. You can see right here, it's way off the scale there as far as there's a couple areas that are just completely white, meaning the content wasn't white. It's just basically so bright it blows out the photo. So you don't want things completely black, completely white unless the content was that, unless this is a nighttime photo or some kind of special circumstance like that. But what you can do to improve this one, if I hit auto, it's going to say, we'll bring this one up a little bit. And that is kind of reasonable. If there were absolutely no pixels here, we'd want to bring that up until where there's pixels start to show up. And you can adjust this middle one. And then you can toggle the visibility of it and see before and after. It just pops out a little bit more. There's more contrast. If the thing is too heavy, you can bring that over to the left, before or after. So it's very subtle. Some of the best lighting adjustments in Photoshop are going to be very subtle. So that's how you use levels in Photoshop. I will see you in the next lecture. In the previous lesson, we went over using levels in Photoshop. In this lesson, you'll learn about curves in Photoshop, which is a little bit more versatile than the levels adjustment, but it's also really easy to mess up an image using curve, but I'll show you how to accurately use it. So go ahead and open up an image. I have sunset.jpg and kelly.jpg, and we can, of course, do an adjustment layer, or we can go to image, adjustments, and then curves, either way. I'm going to use this one because it's a little bit larger, and you can see it on the screen. And you'll see some of the same things in levels. For example, we have setting the black point, the white point, and then the gray point. And just like in levels, we can adjust the red, green, or blue channels one at a time, or RGB all at the same time. So I'm going to move this a little bit over to the side so you can see the effect. How this works is a lot of people come in here and they're not really sure what is going on. Like they'll click and drag this up here, click and drag that down. A lot of people like to make kind of an S-curve. And then you can click and drag these little nodes that we create, and it just changes the look, the tonality of the image down there. If you want to get rid of these nodes, like if you create too many and you're like, oh, I don't need this one here, you can click and drag it just off and it will remove it. And so I'm going to hit cancel and just go back right into it. Image, adjustments, curves. And you'll see over here this little endpoint. This is the darkest point. Got output 0, input 0. If you remember those words from levels, there's a reason. So if I click this up here, output 255, 255. So if you notice, if I click and drag this one in the upper right-hand corner and bring it to the left, see what it's doing? It's making the light areas lighter. So that's just like as if we were in image, adjustments, levels, and then right over here, making the light areas lighter. Same effect. So that's input levels. So if you go to image adjustments, curves, and let's bring this one down and set it to the left, that is affecting the output. And you can see the number right there. So you could take that number and enter it into levels and have the same effect. So if you take this point in the upper right hand corner and move it to the left along the top there, it's going to bring the input down. So it's making the lighter. And then if you bring it along the edge of the right hand side there, it makes the lighter darker. Same thing with the bottom left hand corner. If you bring it up, it makes the darker lighter because that's affecting the output. And then if you bring it to the right along the bottom there, it makes the darker darker. And you can also manually do this with input, these little sliders here as well. Now curves gives us a little bit more customizability though, because we can also click these nodes again in here and just really customize how dark and light the dark and lighter areas of the image are. So you can even out that tone a little bit. You can really mess it up a lot more easily than levels, as you can see there. We do want to be careful with the levels unless you're going for some special effect, like something way off like that, like a negative. You can go to the presets up here. There's a couple interesting presets like color negative. So it has the negative effect, cross process, darker, increased contrast lighter. Some of those you see in the levels as well. And then negative. So if I go back to image, adjustment, levels, there are not some of those negative ones, okay? Because it's not possible to really do that in here. We can only do increased contrast, darker, lighter, midtones adjustments, and you can click and drag these back and forth, and you'll notice it's making it lighter and darker compared to the rest of the image where the shadows and lights and mid-tone values are. But if we go back to curves, there's a little bit more customizability. So why would we use this? Well, one more thing to check out is, besides just trying to overall color correct something and just adjust the lighting and the tonality, we can also click in the lower right hand corner. There's a little, looks like a scrubby zoom icon like when we're zooming in, but or if we're adjusting numbers on a menu. But if you click it, then you can actually sample in here, and you'll notice as I sample, hover over the mouse on the image, it's moving where this little circle is along this line there. So what I can do, let's just say we wanted this grass to pop out more. You can click it and bring it up and down and make that specific tonal range brighter or darker. So let's say this light area here, I bring it down, it's just like I'm making the lighter areas darker. So let's try one more example here. If I open up sunset, this one's a bit underexposed, especially in the foreground, and it's a little bit overexposed with the lens flare in the background. So instead of doing a image adjustment, let's just do the same thing, but with an adjustment layer. So go to the bottom layers panel, click that, and then go to curves. Same menu, just a little bit different where things are. So click there on the hand, and you can click and drag and just bring those green tones up a little bit. And then in the background here, if we bring that down just a little, not too much, then we've got more of an even color here in the image. Still not perfect, but you can kind of see the before and then the after. You can see this is very underexposed, the original image here with the histogram. You can see the kind of the mountain range here off the edge there. Then there's a little bit of overexposed areas. You can see not as much, but over on the right hand side. So instead of just dragging with the curve here, we could try that. But again, you can just click and drag in an image and just click and drag up and down, and it will affect just that specific part of the line there. You can also draw a curve. I mean, I'm not sure too many people do this, but if you just had an idea of a curve, you can click and drag it up like that and then go back to there, and then you've got a custom curve. But I find just keeping it just straight like that and then clicking and dragging in the image, or if you have, you can make an S curve to make kind of it pop more, but it really depends on the image, of course. When you have the adjustment layer, also if you click down here on that little arrow, it's going to reset it to the original, the adjustment default. So that's handy if you really mess up an image and you've got this going all over the place and you're like, you just want to bring it back to the originals. Then just click that arrow and then you can start from scratch. You can click this hand here and then just start editing it again to adjust that photo. So that's the curves adjustment. It can be pretty useful when you're adjusting lighting, tonality in an image, and also when you want certain colors to pop a little bit more. But as far as making colors pop even more than this, where they're just more visible due to the lighting levels, we'll cover that after we cover adjusting brightness and contrast in the next lecture. In the lecture after next, we're going to go over hue adjustments a little bit more in depth that can really make colors pop. So in previous lectures, we went over how to use the curves adjustments as well as the levels adjustments in Photoshop. There are a couple instances where you might not have enough time to really customize your effects and you just want a quick fix as far as contrast or lighting. And so in those instances, you might want to just go to Image, Adjustment, and then there's Brightness and Contrast. And what this does, this is also an adjustment layer you can do, but this one's a little bit larger, has more contrast compared to the background. So what you want to do is on brightness, if you bring that to the left, it just makes it a darker photo, right? If you go all the way to the left, negative 150, it's not completely black though. So it's not, totally underexposing it, for example. It's just adjusting the brightness of the overall photo. And then if you bring it to the right, it's going to make it a much brighter photo. In contrast, what that does after resetting brightness to 0, just to show what this does, if I go over to the right, it just makes the darkers darker and the lighters lighter. If you go to the left, it makes it more of a flat photo, and you can hit auto and it'll try to figure out what it should do. So it doesn't have as much control compared to, say, levels, where you can make the lighter lighter, the darker darker, lighter darker, and darker lighter. it's going to just do two of those at once. So if we go to image adjustments, brightness, contrast, with contrast again, the darker is getting darker and the lighter is getting lighter at the same time, and then the opposite on the left. Now, if you go to image adjustments, exposure, if you think about in photography, if you have your shutter speed open for a long time, it's a longer exposure, right? The longer the film or the digital sensor is exposed to the light. So if you go to the right, it's simulating what it would look like with the longer shutter speed, for example, or a wide open aperture, kind of, in a way, without adjusting the depth of field, of course. But so if you go over to the right, eventually it just becomes all white. If you go all the way to the left, it's completely black. So if you just want a slightly darker photo or lighter photo, you can adjust the exposure there. Now if you go to offset, if you go all the way to the right, it's not affecting the highlights as much. It's mostly affecting the dark areas, the shadows, and the midtones. So if you go to the left, it's going to be completely black, except some of the highlighted areas are not. And go to the right, it's really bright around here, but again, the highlights don't change too much. It's just affecting the shadows and the midtone values. And then finally, gamma correction or midtone values, if you go to the left, it's just affecting the brightness, except the opposite. It's not going, it's not getting darker as we go to the left like it would with the exposure. It's getting brighter. And then if you go to the right, it gets darker. So there's a couple different ways to affect it. The defaults are 0, 0, and 1. And if you use these, setting the dark point, the gray point, and the white point, it's a little bit different than the levels eyedropper tools. It's not affecting all the color range. So what I mean by that is if you use this to set the black point in the exposure tool, and let's just say, let's find a dark area here, and you click it, see how it only affects the offset? So I click all around, it's only affecting the offset there. It's not trying to adjust the exposure or the gamma correction. Now, I'm going to bring that back to 0. If I set the gray point, let me just guess here, it only affects, as you can see, the exposure. Now, if I go to, setting the white point, click that, it's only affecting the exposure as well. So setting the gray point and the white point only affect the exposure, as you can see. But when we're setting the black point, it affects the offset. So I'm going to hit cancel, just go back, I'm going to reset that so we can look at this again one more time. So this is more effective in higher bit photos, say like 16-bit and 32-bit. With 8-bit, it can be kind of extreme when we go too far in one direction. We don't have as much dynamic range or the amount of light between complete black and complete white. So what you can do, if this is just making the changes too quickly, if it's just too drastic as you move that slider, what you can do is hold Control on the PC or Command on the Mac, and then you hover over the number, it turns into a scrubby slider, so you can actually click and drag, and it's very subtle. You'll see that slider is moving a lot more slowly. So you can do that for all three. Alright, so that's just a quick tip. Hold on to Control on the PC, Command on the Mac, hover over these numbers, and you can adjust these with a little bit more precision. So those are the quick photo fixes of adjusting brightness, contrast, and exposure. Again, some of them are not as versatile as curves and levels, but sometimes it might be all that you need as far as just brightening up a photo or adding a little bit more contrast. In the next lesson, we'll cover making photos pop a little bit more and adding a little bit more lightness and saturation in a photo. In this lesson, you'll learn how to adjust hues and saturation and lightness in an image, and also show you how to adjust color of something selectively in a photo without even using selections. So go ahead and open up some of the support files like boston.jpg, and there's a couple ways to do this, but first I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation, rather than doing Adjustment Layer, just so you can see it. It's a little bit larger dialog box as opposed to going to the other one. And there's a couple settings we have here. There's Hue, Saturation, and Lightness. And by default, we're affecting all of the areas of color. So all the different hues, reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, and magentas. And so if you just click and drag left and right, you'll see it interact with the original color. And so it's just kind of changing this really strange colors if you go left and right. Now, if you go to saturation, just leave hue at 0, which is the default, and then go to saturation, you can make the colors pop out a bit more. And if you go too far, it really overdoes it, obviously, but you can make it pop out a bit. Toggle the preview to see the before and after. And you can also go to lightness and make it a little bit lighter, eventually go to completely white, completely dark. So you can adjust that as well to try to improve the photo. And there's one other option where you hit colorize. It just makes it one hue, and then you can just click and drag this left and right, and you'll see the specific hue that it'll turn it to. And I'm going to open up another photo here. This is kelly.jpg from the support files. It's a portrait photo, and this time instead of going to image adjustments, hue saturation, let's just do an adjustment layer. So click on the bottom of the layers panel and go to hue saturation. And you'll see it looks a little bit different, but a lot of the same options are here. So there's hue, you can see there, saturation, make it pop out a bit more, lightness, and so on, and colorize. And so if you take the hue and see how it can just interact with the original, and one quick tip, if you hold on to Control on the PC or Command on the Mac, you can actually, if you hover over down here, click and drag, and that moves just the color range left or right. And then as you move that, it'll just interact a little bit differently. Now, the reason we would want to do an adjustment layer, besides adding a mask and it's a live effect so we can double click and redo it again, I'm just gonna delete that and just create another one. And what's pretty neat about this is you can selectively adjust hues with this little button here. So if you click it and then you'll hover over here, and let's just say we wanted the green to pop out more, you can click it and click left and right, and you'll see the saturation goes up. Wait, I'll just exaggerate so you can see. So it can go up to plus 100, or you can make it grayscale. Now, if you hold on to Control on the PC or Command on the Mac and go left and right, that actually brings the hue. You can change the hue of a specific area as well. So for example, let's just say her hair color here. If I click on that first, click, drag left and right, that just adjusts the saturation. But if I hold Control, click and drag, now I can actually change the color of that specific area that I originally clicked. So if that's not clear, let me just do another one here with a landscape photo. This is zoom and navigation beach.jpg from the support files. So if you click on the bottom layers panel, add new adjustment layer, let's go to hue saturation. Now, one other thing here, if you do some kind of effect and you want to go back to the original, the default, you can click this little icon on the bottom there, and that's pretty useful. But let's just say we wanted the blue in this landscape photo to pop out more. Well, we can click right here, and you can hover over it. It tells you if you have tooltips turned on. Click and drag in the image to modify saturation, basically just that hue range, and then Control click or Command click on the Mac to modify the hue of that specific area. So this blue area here, click and drag left and right. You'll make it more saturated, including the ocean there, and then left will make it more of a grayscale. So if you go a little bit over to the right, make that really pop out more. What's cool is this comes with a mask. So if you're on the mask and you can paint in some black, let's just say we wanted the sky to pop out a lot, but not the ocean, we can use a soft edge brush here, click and drag, and we mask out that effect so it shows through to the original layer. And we can click this effect here. It's a live effect, so we can go back to it and click this little icon here. And now let's just say this sand here, we wanted to change the color of it. So I'm going to hold down Control, click and drag, and let's just go over to way over there. All right, see how it's kind of changing the hue a little bit? And you can see down at the bottom, see the range? You can affect that. Let's just saturate that area there. I'll just exaggerate so you can see. All right, so obviously we don't want to keep it like that, and obviously I don't want that effect. But I'm just showing you what this does. But one really cool use for the hue saturation is to selectively adjust color. So I'm going to delete this top layer here. So I just have an image. This isn't from the support files, but it's a stock photo. But you can open up any image that you just want to change the color of, but selectively, so certain areas. So you could use new layers and just paint on top and change the layer blending mode of that new layer above it. That's one way to do it. So for example, if I do a new layer and let's just choose kind of a bluish color, well, the background doesn't matter, but so for the foreground, let's just say bluish. And if I click and drag over there, obviously that's just covering it up, right? Just covering it up. And then I change the blending mode, though, of this top new layer that just has that brush on it to something else like multiply or screen or overlay or color. And it's going to change, you know, and I can keep coloring on here, right? It keeps the texture of the original layer below it, right? So I'd want to mix selections to do that a little bit more accurately. But obviously, that's the effect. You could add a mask and paint in, for example, if you click on the bottom of the layers panel, adds a little mask there. Then it would actually erase out. If you messed up, you could paint white in and it will bring back that color, right? So that's one way to adjust the hue. Another way, let's just say we had this image here. I'm going to press Control J on the PC or Command J on the Mac. That'll just allow us to work on a duplicated layer. And let's just say I was using the polygonal lasso tool and I made a selection and I'm just going around this. And for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to just do this top part as well as I'm going to hold Shift to add to, maybe just this part over here, just to make a quick selection. We could use the quick selection tool, but this has a bunch of straight lines, so it should be fine. I would obviously zoom in more using Control or Command plus or minus as I work if I was making this actual selection with the polygonal lasso tool. But just to give you an idea, so those two areas are selected. And what you could do is go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, and then you can change the hue there, or you can hit Colorize, and then you'll know specifically what color it would be. It would actually match this little slider up here. So let's just say you wanted to make it something like that, make it more saturated, you know, whatever, maybe a bluish. All right. And then if it was too strong, because we were working on a new layer that was duplicated, we can bring the opacity down a little bit, just adjust that as needed. But another way to do that without having to make a selection, and I talked about that at the beginning of this lesson, this is another way to adjust the hue selectively without having to make a selection at all. So what you want to do is create a new adjustment layer, the bottom of the layers panel, and go to Hue Saturation. And instead of doing a selection first, what we can do up here where it says Master, just change that to the color that you want to change. So let's just change the reds. All right, and I'll pull this over here to the side. And you can make just the reds pop out, like so, and just bring the saturation up. Or you can adjust the hue, like so, or you can hit Colorize as well. The problem, however, is when we choose Colorize, you can see up here, it's defaulted to Master. It's just changing everything. So I'm going to uncheck Colorize, bring that back to reds, and now I'm just going to experiment here and try to get it to kind of a bluish, or you could go the other way, make it green, either way. And so then we've got our effect. The problem, however, is that you can see right there that some parts of the inside, like maybe the stick shift, but also the steering wheel, definitely change colors as well. We don't want that. So the great thing is that this adjustment layer comes with its own mask. So set the foreground color to black, choose a nice soft edge brush, and just click and drag this out here. All right, and then this stick shift, it didn't really change that too much. Let me paint some white in, bring some of that back. Yeah, it did change it, but we painted black too far. So if I paint black too far in, let's just say this far, how do I bring that back in? So the effect, remember, just paint in white. That'll bring that mask back in there. So wherever it's black, it'll show through to the original, just as if we had the icon here selected. So you can toggle that and see the before and after and see if we need to change anywhere else. But that's pretty good for this effect. So that's how you change hue, saturation, and lightness overall in a photo, or selectively, either by clicking and dragging using the one tool to emphasize certain colors, or by using this effect where we can adjust certain hues selectively.